Hello, my name is Bruce Eder, and I'd like to welcome you to this complete edition of The Devil and Daniel Webster. Those of you who have only seen The Devil and Daniel Webster in its 84-minute version, or the interim restoration of the movie that was done in the early 1990s, are in for a treat. This release marks the first presentation of the complete 106-minute Devil and Daniel Webster from a proper preservation-quality 35mm source, the first public presentation of the movie in that form in 50 years, since it was cut for reissue in 1952. For all intents and purposes, this is the first time anyone under the age of around 70 will be seeing the movie in the form and in the quality the makers intended. The previously cut footage reveals far more about the characters and also of the New England setting that was so important to the origins and content of the story. The Devil and Daniel Webster is part of a tradition of Americana, of a piece with Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It was spawned from a regional literary tradition as a short story, which was carried over to William Dieterle's movie. We're about to go into one of the restored sequences, which establishes both the mysterious Mr. Scratch, played by Walter Huston, and the precise depths of both the poverty and piety of Jabez Stone and his family. This is a good opportunity to talk about the production background of The Devil and Daniel Webster. The Devil and Daniel Webster began shooting in March of 1941 under William Dieterle at RKO. At the time, RKO, under head of production George Schaefer, was in its artistic heyday. Citizen Kane had just been released, The Magnificent Ambersons was going into production, and the studio was a hotbed of cinematic experimentation. At the time, the movie's working title was A Certain Mr. Scratch. The title of The Devil and Daniel Webster has always been a point of confusion. Today it is best known by that name, which is also the name of the short story that it was based on. And on its face it would seem logical that Dieterle and RKO would have used that title from the outset. The problem was that in 1941, there were parts of the country, especially in the South, where putting the devil on a movie marquee created difficulty that distributors wished to avoid. The other problem was the name Daniel Webster. It was evocative of a period piece, and films with period settings have always been a hard sell, especially to male audiences. In fact, the period setting is one of the factors that is often cited not only in the original box office failure of The Devil and Daniel Webster, which lost $35,000 when originally released, but also of Orson Welles' The Magnificent Ambersons, which was made at approximately the same time. Warner Brothers could sell Errol Flynn's swordplay, and Dieterle himself had a string of successes at Warner with historical biographies such as the story of Louis Pasteur. But these were the exceptions rather than the rule. Apart from westerns and adventure films, period subjects were trouble, and so, for marketing purposes, was any title using the name Daniel Webster. The studio agonized for months over the title. A Certain Mr. Scratch was used in press announcements, and RKO began taking random surveys in California. Some of the alternatives that were considered were Black Daniel, The Devil to Pay, It Can Happen to You, and Temptation. That last might have raised associations with a song by Arthur Freed and Nacio Herb Brown that had been very popular in the 1930s. But The Devil and Daniel Webster was the overwhelming favorite. At one point, someone even half-jokingly recommended Soul versus Heel. In June of 1941, previews were announced as The Devil and Daniel Webster, but at the July 16th preview, the film's name was changed to Here Is a Man. When it finally opened 3 months later, the movie's title was All That Money Can Buy, a phrase that Mr. Scratch uses to tempt Jabez Stone into selling his soul. Sometime after the initial release, however, prints were distributed with the title The Devil and Daniel Webster. And just to add to the confusion, in 1952, Astor Pictures recut The Devil and Daniel Webster from 106 to 99 and then to 84 minutes under the name Daniel and the Devil, and Variety's index still lists it as Here Is a Man. While we're on this scene, Jeff Corey, whom we're about to meet as Tom Sharp, told a very funny story about the pig that James Craig is struggling with. It seems that The Devil and Daniel Webster was shot in an unusual fashion, in that it was shot almost sequentially. That is, each major scene was filmed in the order in which it appears in the script. So this whole opening sequence on the stone farm was begun on the first day's shooting. It seems that this pig created all kinds of problems, because he wouldn't keep quiet so that they could finish a take. Finally, a prop man made a suggestion that worked. He came over and massaged the pig's scrotum, and it was quiet for the remainder of the day's shooting. Back to the film's history, William Dieterle left Warner Brothers in 1940, after 10 years there, and went to RKO, where he made The Hunchback of Notre Dame. That became one of the biggest moneymakers in RKO's entire history. Its success, coupled with his earlier screen triumphs with The Life of Émile Zola and The Story of Louis Pasteur, brought Dieterle an opportunity that had been denied him at Warner Brothers, to set up his own production company. Late in 1940, he announced that he had purchased the rights to the short story The Devil and Daniel Webster by Stephen Vincent Benét, and that Paul Muni and Claude Rains were among those interested in playing the devil. For Daniel Webster, he'd chosen Thomas Mitchell, a playwright-turned-actor, familiar to viewers for his roles in Stagecoach, Gone with the Wind, and the Frank Capra movies Lost Horizon, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and It's a Wonderful Life. Production began early in March from a script written by Benét and Dan Totherow, with Walter Huston cast as the devil and Thomas Mitchell as Daniel Webster. Speaking of the script and the complete version of the film, this entire sequence establishes elements that are vital to the rest of the picture. The Devil and Daniel Webster is usually described as an American version of the Faust legend. It's an easy bit of shorthand for television reviewers, but the film is more than that. Faust is the story of a man who sells his soul to the devil, but the character of Faust, that of a frustrated scholar with grand ambitions beyond his means to achieve them, was hardly one with strong appeal to American sensibilities. Stephen Vincent Benét's 1936 short story, recasting the Faust figure as a farmer who only wants an even chance at survival for himself and his family, makes all the difference. It extends the story's appeal far beyond the European origins of the Faust legend. The film's setting is supposed to be 1841, but if you listen to the script, there are all kinds of veiled and not-so-veiled references to 1941. The United States was still then a country made up mostly of small towns and was really just coming out of the economic depression of the 1930s. The harsh conditions of the earlier decade were still very much in people's minds and evoked some very primal fears from all audiences. The characters of Tom Sharp, Eli Higgins, and Van Brooks are going to be a kind of Greek chorus as the film progresses, bringing us up to date across the passage of time. Here they're setting the stage for the larger social background of the movie. We know that Stone feels set upon, but now we're going to hear a little bit about the larger plight of the farmers, and their victimization by loan sharks, and the first mention of Miser Stevens. In this dialogue, so colorful and funny in its nasty way, we get a sense of the hatred of the farmers for the loan sharks, and our first hint of the supernatural at work, the description of a loan shark's death in a strange hailstorm. Given what we learn later, it sounds as though Mr. Scratch closed out one of those long-standing accounts. And we later learn that Scratch likes using hailstorms.
They might not like the idea down in Washington.
This previously lost dialogue sets the stage for the first appearance by Daniel Webster, into which it dissolves. The loan sharks like Stevens represent malignant capitalism, driving people off their land, while the Farmers Association is discussed in terms that any union organizer of the 1930s could appreciate. Now we're at the point where the short version of the film begins, with the devil trying to tempt Daniel Webster. Of course, at this point, we've only glimpsed Mr. Scratch in the opening of the restored scenes, and now we see him as a strangely shaped shadow, whispering to Webster. Shadows, as we'll see, play very important parts in this film. It is in the character of Webster that the script has its most difficult task, that of mixing a known historical figure with his persona out of legend, and making it flesh and blood and real. There was, of course, an American statesman named Daniel Webster, who lived from 1782 to 1852, represented Massachusetts in the Senate, and served as Secretary of State. The irony is that Benét's short story and this film, which drew upon the Webster of New Hampshire legend, are so well known that the legendary Webster has eclipsed the historical figure In a strangely ironic way, the historical Webster does hang over this script, and the story of temptation and selling out one's neighbors does apply to him. Webster did in fact want to be president and ran unsuccessfully several times. During his final years, he betrayed the farmers who believed so passionately in him and went to work in the hire of the industrial interests. I've been so busy getting into the background and history that I've ignored some of the cinematic elements in front of us. The story has just advanced a full week in the series of dissolves that we've seen. This narrative structure, here a montage in which the dialogue overlaps between scenes and characters in different locations and time frames, is far freer and handled far more lyrically than the structure of Dieterle's other major films up to this time. One can't help but wonder about the influence of Citizen Kane on the film's structure. Robert Wise, who edited both Citizen Kane and The Devil and Daniel Webster, denies that The Devil and Daniel Webster was influenced in any way by Wells's movie. It's safe to say that William Dieterle, who was a 20-year veteran of filmmaking in both Germany and America, wouldn't consciously have tried to imitate Orson Welles. But it's just as likely that Wells's film, and what it had achieved with lap dissolves, montage, and other narrative shorthand, freed filmmakers to use these devices more creatively than they had been up to that time. Certainly the use of long, uninterrupted passages of dialogue is something that Welles made work, and that others quickly picked up on. The script at this point takes us back into a deeper, more personal view of Jabez Stone. His talk of seed as something that is alive, and of wanting to be a farmer and nothing more, struck a responsive chord with audiences in 1941. All of these scenes, as well as the complete introductory sequence, are major embellishments on the original story by Stephen Vincent Benét. This is a good opportunity to talk about Benét and the story. It's curious how an artistic reputation can be altered by time. In his own time, Stephen Vincent Benét was one of the most popular and highly regarded authors of his generation. In the late 1920s, while Hemingway and others were lamenting the lost generation, Benét celebrated the grand procession of American history and was loved for it. Born in 1898, the son and grandson of military men, Benét was raised on various army posts, but most of his childhood was spent in California on San Francisco Bay. He graduated from Yale, where he won the John Masefield Literary Prize 3 times, and was a close friend of Thornton Wilder, Archibald MacLeish, and Philip Barry, as well as future publisher John Farrar. Benét later studied in Paris and worked for the Paris edition of the Chicago Tribune. He had grown up with a desire to write a work based on the military histories in his father's library. A 1926 Guggenheim Fellowship allowed him to pursue this goal, and the result was John Brown's Body, an epic poem about the war between the states that won the 1928 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry and sold 500,000 copies over the next 7 years. In 1936, Benét's short story The Devil and Daniel Webster appeared in the Saturday Evening Post. In creating it, he explained, he went to the Daniel Webster of local New Hampshire legend rather than the history texts. This Webster is the equivalent of John Ford's young Mr. Lincoln, larger than life but also a very human figure. Not the statesman but the hero of local renown, with a ram named Goliath and a fishing rod that could draw fish as soon as its line touched the water. The story, with its strange mix of folklore, myth, and mysticism, was an instant success, winning both the Theodore Roosevelt Medal and the O. Henry Memorial Award. It wasn't long afterward that Benét adapted The Devil and Daniel Webster into an opera with music by Douglas Moore, and also into a one-act play. The opera version possesses a curious historical tie to Citizen Kane. The operatic Devil and Daniel Webster was produced in New York during May of 1939 under the auspices of the American Lyric Theater, directed by John Houseman. At the time, Houseman was Orson Welles' partner and collaborator in the Mercury Theater. The American Lyric Theater was a very short-lived experiment, and no sooner had it ceased to exist than Houseman was brought out to Hollywood by Welles as part of the RKO contract that led to Citizen Kane. I'm going to pause for a moment to talk a bit about this particular sequence, our first meeting with Mr. Scratch. You can see how the shadows are starting to play in this sequence. Joseph August, the cinematographer, loved to work with deep shadows. This is obvious to anyone who has seen his other films with Dieterle, The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Portrait of Jenny. According to Linwood Dunn of the RKO Special Effects Department, Walter Huston's entrance, complete with his incendiary calling card, was accomplished through the careful use of double exposure and an optical printer. One of the attributes of this movie that people find most likable today is that special effects are so low-keyed, that little flame is so understated. The overall effect, which seems to place Huston on another plane of existence, is extremely disconcerting, particularly when the cries of the animals and Bernard Herrmann's almost subliminal scoring, which Stephen Smith will say more about later, are added on. This is Huston's first major scene, and it captures the supernatural mood of Benét's story perfectly. In the book, Mr. Scratch is described as a soft-spoken, dark-dressed stranger with plentiful white teeth that might have been filed to a point. His arrival sends Stone's dog running for the hills with his tail between his legs. Huston has more folksiness, sinister but beguiling, and there's a little bit of the dreaming huckster that Huston would call upon 7 years later for his portrayal of Howard, the aging prospector, in The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. I'd like to make a few comments here about various members of the crew beyond Bernard Herrmann and Robert Wise. Joseph August, the cinematographer, was a 30-year veteran of the movie business and had worked with William S. Hart in the silent era, most notably on Tumbleweeds, and had photographed a brace of important movies during the 1930s, including John Ford's The Informer and The Plow and the Stars, George Cukor's Sylvia Scarlett, and Howard Hawks's 20th Century and Gunga Din.
Someone's calling you, Mr. Stone.
Jabez Stone! Oh, there he is.
August's photography on The Devil and Daniel Webster was recalled 6 years later by producer David O. Selznick when he began preparing Portrait of Jenny with Dieterle directing, and he specifically wanted the same cinematographer along with the same director. Several other members of the crew worked on that project. Dieterle's dialogue director, Peter Bernay, did one draft of the Portrait of Jenny script. And his personal assistant, Argyle Nelson, also assisted on the Selznick movie. August died on the set of that movie during the extended shooting of Portrait of Jenny. As for Argyle Nelson, he ended up working on I Love Lucy in the 1950s and The Dick Van Dyke Show in the 1960s. As for William Dieterle, he was, like Jeff Corey, later a victim of the Red Scare. In 1941, he helped bring Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill to the United States, and he became guilty by association with both of them. He was also suspected of being a premature anti-Nazi, I love that phrase, for his involvement with a 1938 movie entitled Blockade, which dealt with the Spanish Civil War. His passport was confiscated twice by the authorities in the course of investigating him before he was allowed to resume working. He directed Magic Fire, a bizarre low-budget biography of Wagner, in which ex-showgirl Yvonne De Carlo played Cosima, and returned to Paramount for the African-based drama Elephant Walk in 1954. After that, he spent most of his career in Europe, and he faded out amid a series of box office failures.
Good luck. You'll have money and all that money can buy. Upon my word, neighbor Stone, if it were not for my...
In most movies, viewers are lucky if the lighting is appropriate for the setting in which a scene is supposed to take place. There are some very bad day-for-night shots in The Devil and Daniel Webster, in fact. But now let's look closely at one of the most successfully lit scenes in a well-photographed movie. While Stone and Mr. Scratch have been talking, something has happened to the barn that wasn't obvious in earlier editions of this film, but is a wonderful transformation. This is a New England dusk in the month of April, in an indoor setting partly open to the outside, and the detail is amazing. The sun has gotten lower, and the shadows have lengthened and grown deeper as the scene progresses. Earlier video editions of The Devil and Daniel Webster muted these contrasts, making it difficult to fully appreciate these shadows in the composition.
One that will last till doomsday. I congratulate you, neighbor Stone. You're going to be...
The clap of thunder and the talk of doomsday add an ominous note, again almost subliminally. The script is extremely clever at this point. It's tough to make a picture in which the devil is a leading character and not talk about damnation, but standards were different in those days, and the word damnation couldn't be used. In fact, even the devil is mentioned only obliquely, but they managed to have a little fun with the phrase, "I'll be damned." And Huston's exit is the capper to one of the most eerily flamboyant introductions in screen history. The tree with the date burned into it is a detail that isn't in the original story, but it's very compelling visually. Especially that smoke that rises from that unholy cigar that Scratch is smoking. The tree is a perfect visual symbol of the unholy bargain that Jabez has made. Although it is never made clear whether, like a man driven by a guilty conscience, Stone is the only one who can see the date burned into it. Notice here how the shadows have lengthened in the Stone household. This is also a visual signal that will follow Jabez around for the rest of the movie, and be repeated in our dealings with Miser Stevens. Getting back to Benét, the operatic Devil and Daniel Webster was structured as a work in a single act. It starts at a party for Stone and his wife, some years after his success in farming, business, and politics, with Daniel Webster as the guest of honor. Mr. Scratch is one of the guests, and during the dance, as someone says, the devil seems to have gotten into the fiddle. This notion is expanded considerably in the film's Harvest Dance. A moth with a death's head suddenly gets loose from Mr. Scratch's mysterious sample box, and it cries out with the voice of Miser Stevens. Stone's unholy bargain is revealed, along with the fact that the devil has come to claim him, and the bulk of the opera is made up of the trial sequence and Daniel Webster's spirited defense of Stone. For those interested, Douglas Moore's music is melodic and enjoyable, if not overly ambitious. Indeed, Houseman wrote that he especially appreciated the opera's straightforward, unpretentious nature, although he also felt that his Daniel Webster, Lansing Hatfield, was merely adequate. The Devil and Daniel Webster opened to favorable if unenthusiastic reviews, but the abrupt end of the American Lyric Theater closed it. The work is published by Boozy and Hawkes, and has since been revived in a recording on the Phoenix label, and was most recently performed by the Bronx Opera Company during their spring 1991 season. This sequence, in which the newly enriched Jabez Stone goes to town, is the most upbeat in the movie. This will be his last completely happy day for the next 7 years, as his life comes to be filled with recriminations over what he has done. Stone will descend into genuine sin, and the movie takes on the dark, Germanic mood for which it is known. It's interesting that the two leads, James Craig and Anne Shirley, who play Jabez and Mary Stone, are so often overlooked by fans. James Craig was born John Henry Meader in Nashville, Tennessee in 1912, and was an athlete turned actor. A quarterback and tennis player at Rice University, Craig trained in drama and came to Hollywood by way of Houston, Texas in 1934. His first major film was The Buccaneer in 1938, starring Frederick March and directed by Cecil B. DeMille. His big break was in the movie Kitty Foyle, made at RKO in 1940, in which he played the young doctor who competes for the love of Ginger Rogers. Craig was signed by MGM in 1941 as a wartime replacement for Clark Gable, who had joined the Army Air Force. The two bore a striking resemblance which isn't obvious here because Craig had taken off his mustache for the role of Jabez Stone. This scene must have given a tremendous visceral pleasure to audiences in 1941, with their fresh memories of the Great Depression. Dieterle and the performers play it up for all it is worth, and watch the manic look on John Quaylen's face as the gold coins roll across the table in front of him.
Fair enough. Come along, Sheriff.
And then comes the ominous moment as Stevens, worried and suspicious, compares the coins with which Stone has just paid the mortgage with those that he was counting, and sees that they are identical. It seems someone else is doing business with the firm that set him up, and his backer is now undercutting him. This is a particularly mercantilistic vision of the devil's work that fits the film. Bankers and lenders for profit are shown to be evil in the manner of any number of social tracts from the depths of the Great Depression. The interaction with Stevens contains the implication that all of the people's troubles lie with loan sharks and, in a larger sense, with the capitalist system. As I said, this is an amazingly leftist film, given its setting and background. But these politics are also a very curious element, because neither of the writers responsible for the screenplay were known to be especially leftist in their sentiments. Stephen Vincent Benét collaborated on the writing of the screenplay for Dieterle's movie with a playwright named Dan Tothero. Benét had worked on screenplays since 1930 when D.W. Griffith engaged him, after being unable to secure the services of Carl Sandburg, to write the script for Abraham Lincoln. This was also the film that brought Walter Huston to Hollywood. Since then, Benét had worked in Hollywood intermittently, as his time allowed, including a contribution to the screenplay adaptation of Robert Sherwood's Abe Lincoln in Illinois, starring Raymond Massey. I'll talk a bit more about Benét's collaborator, Dan Tothero, later on, but now we're getting our first close-up look at Daniel Webster, as played by Edward Arnold.
Well, I really have to go now. The people over across corners must be waiting for me.
Well, it's really not very far, Mr. Webster.
Oh, it's you again. What do you want?
Well, I thought with the presidential election coming up, you might need some help, Mr. Webster, sir.
I'd rather see you on the side of the opposition.
Oh, I'll be there, too.
Say, that was
Arnold wasn't Dieterle's original choice to play the part. In fact, The Devil and Daniel Webster had nearly been finished after 6 weeks of shooting, with Thomas Mitchell playing Webster, when an accident occurred on the set. Mitchell ended up in the hospital, and Dieterle was forced to replace him on one day's notice with Edward Arnold. Arnold himself was a major screen figure, at least based on his performances from the 1930s and early 1940s. He was born Gunther Schneider in New York City in 1890. Orphaned at age 11, he worked all kinds of jobs trying to support himself, including tending the boilers at Columbia University. Arnold was drawn to acting, and at age 15 he played his first professional role in Trenton, New Jersey. He worked in silent films in Chicago, mostly at S&A Studios, and then returned to Broadway in 1925. Arnold became a successful character actor, portraying a multitude of roles, including gangsters in the play and film Whistling in the Dark, and Louis XIII in the film Cardinal Richelieu, starring George Arliss. He played the title role in Meet Nero Wolfe, and the police inspector in Crime and Punishment, but Arnold didn't really hit his stride until directors came to recognize just how right he was playing wealthy, powerful men. His most memorable such portrayal was in Come and Get It, co-starring Frances Farmer, but he also made his mark in Mitchell Leisen's screwball comedy Easy Living, and Frank Capra's You Can't Take It With You, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Meet John Doe.
And look who's with him.
I want to tell a story from Jeff Corey that illustrates one of William Dieterle's eccentricities. Corey and Walter Huston were playing horseshoes during the shooting of this scene in which the boy announces Daniel Webster's here. Then they noticed that the director was going through take after take of the actor yelling, Daniel Webster's here. Now, Dieterle was an unusual man. He was a great believer in astrology. In fact, he had started shooting 2 days earlier than scheduled because his wife's reading of his horoscope said that he should. But here, everyone was surprised because he was using the entire afternoon for this one shot without telling the boy what was wrong. Finally, after 70 takes, the boy was taken aside by the dialogue coach, and then did the shouting in a German accent, imitating Dieterle. The director said, very good, and moved on. Obviously, that take was never used. It was just one of those bizarre eccentricities of the director.
Cross corners. He said you had horns and a tail, Mr. Webster, but I ain't seen him yet.
Well, you see, Martin, I only wear them when I'm in Washington. That's the trouble. But if you ever get down there, I'll be glad to show them to you.
Gee, would you, Mr. Webster?
Back to Edward Arnold. The Devil and Daniel Webster was a comeback to leading roles for him. He had been moving into supporting roles for several years, and even though it lost money, this movie did return Arnold to more prominent parts. MGM put him into his own short-lived mystery series with Eyes in the Night and The Hidden Eye, in which he played the blind detective Duncan MacLean. The man responsible for establishing the Webster character was the screenplay's principal author, Dan Tothero, himself a major playwright. Benét knew the folklore and had created the characters, but it was Tothero who was responsible for the complexities and details of the relationships between Jabez Stone and his family and neighbors. Tothero's other screen credits include the scripts for the 1929 version of The Virginians, starring Gary Cooper and Walter Huston, and Warner Brothers' The Dawn Patrol. He was born in California in 1894 and wrote his first play while attending high school in Marin County. It was so successful that he presented it in nearby towns. Tothero joined a vaudeville troupe as an actor and spent 2 years on the road, with a lengthy stage career a real possibility before the First World War sent him to Europe. This speech, by the way, establishes Jabez as an up-and-coming figure in the community. Note the distorted shadow cast by John Quaylen's Miser Stevens, who seems almost a wraith-like presence. That is a fine, brilliant touch by Joe August behind the camera.
If he chooses cross-corner sunshine to rest in, now that's mighty fine. And I want to say this before I quit.
Back to Tothero. By the time he returned from 2 years at the war, he had given up acting. I had little youth left after serving in France, he admitted, and decided to try writing. He suffered hardship and poverty for several years and spent much of one winter in New York, staying at the public library as much as possible in order to keep warm. He sold a few stories and began working on a play based on an incident in his own family's history. The Breaking of the Calm dramatized the voyage of his own grandmother from England to California by ship around Cape Horn. That play was produced in San Francisco and encouraged Tothero to keep writing. Later, he wrote a play called The Wild Birds, which won first prize in a competition awarded by a committee whose judges included Eugene O'Neill and George Jean Nathan. Tothero returned to New York for a production of The Wild Birds at the Cherry Lane Theater, which became a major success. He followed this with Distant Drums, which became a movie, and a play about the Bronte sisters called More Born. Then, in 1936, he wrote Searching for the Sun, which anticipated Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath with its story about young people from the Midwest trying to escape dire poverty by moving to California. His 1942 novel, Deep Valley, about a wine grower's daughter who falls in love with a convict, was also compared very favorably to Steinbeck's work and was made into a film starring Ida Lupino and Dane Clark. We've arrived at another one of the lost scenes, and probably the most psychologically revealing sequence in the film, insofar as the relationship between Jabez and Mary Stone is concerned. In the short version of the film, we really don't see them getting much pleasure from each other's company, but in the opening sequence we've already seen how Mary and Jabez sustain each other. What we see in the long film are scenes from a marriage that are utterly lacking in the 84-minute version, and these sequences make it much easier to accept both James Craig and Anne Shirley in their roles. They are real characters with doubts and pain and a relationship. This whole scene is brilliant as written, directed, and scored. This is the aftermath of Jabez's speech, and there is something different about him which Mary doesn't quite understand. If you look carefully, you can see the gentle offer of her hand, interrupted by Mr. Scratch on a nocturnal visit. The scene is lyrical and poignant, and watching it, it's easy to understand why this movie is considered so special among all of Dieterle's pictures. He was seldom ever quite this eloquent. Only in The Hunchback of Notre Dame does he really come close to communicating this sharply, directly, and simply. Some credit should also go to Bernard Herrmann. Listen to Herrmann's oboe quotation of Springfield Mountain, the folk song that appears throughout the score, giving voice to the uncertainty and fear haunting Stone. He sees Scratch crossing his property and knows that he will be a regular visitor. There's nothing that he can do about it, but he has Mary, who is still untainted by his error, and she sustains him. Craig and Shirley's faces communicate the scene's fear and longing wordlessly and poignantly. The saddest, most wrenching scene in the movie.
Lord, we thank thee for this food.
Stone still has Mary, but he hasn't been saved from his fate. He now challenges his mother over religion and his devotion to it, and Mary is caught between them. This is a setup that could have come from one of Totharo's plays, and become central to The Devil and Daniel Webster.
Now you look here, Ma. I'm not a boy anymore, and I want that understood. And I don't aim to stay a one-horse farmer the rest of my life.
Mary tells Jabez, "You once said we'd never change." He replies, "Never mind what I said once, listen to what I say now. I've made up my mind," and leaves, with Mary still sitting at the table looking worried for her husband. Ma Stone then says, "Was that my son talking?" Here is where we see more rot set in on Jabez's personality, and his seduction of his fellow farmers, starting with the most vulnerable of them.
Oh, you don't have to go to Miser Stevens while I'm around.
Don't I? No. Say, that's mighty white of you.
Not at all, Hank, not at all. I'm glad to help you.
Thank you, Jabez. I really wouldn't need very much. If you could just let me have some seed to start off with, enough for spring planting.
Seed, the easiest thing in the world. Come along, Hank. Pick out everything you need right now.
This particular section is clever. Hank doesn't have to go to Miser Stevens while Jabez is around. No, sir. Nobody needs Stevens anymore, as we'll soon find out. The ironies and conflicts here are multi-leveled. Supported by his good fortune, Jabez has the best seed in New Hampshire, and he's not a man to get rich on other people's hard luck. But that's exactly what he's going to do.
Here, the best seed you'll find in all New Hampshire.
This section of the film is a visual pastoral, scored to yet another Bernard Herrmann variation on Springfield Mountain. The scoring for oboe, harp, flute, and strings is exquisite, and one of the finest pieces of work in Herrmann's output. But notice just how dark the score turns over the dissolve to the image of Mary, who is now pregnant, and Jabez, who is pregnant with doubts about what he has done. It's here that Craig's performance takes on tragic elements, as his character becomes consumed by guilt. This is where the film intersects with Benét's original story, although in the original, Jabez already has children when he makes his bargain with the devil. We read in him the sense of loss and of time being spent that he will have to surrender at the end of his contract. There's also a certain historical irony here in Ma Stone's account of Daniel Webster and his value to the community. The idea that he is being well paid for what he does, but that he helps others. For in the end, the real Webster did sell his talents to a bidder higher than his neighbors or his New England farm constituency. If Craig seems especially sincere and compelling in these scenes, by the way, it may have been because of an incident that was taking place in his own life. He had just had a child of his own, who had been deathly ill at one point and kept him awake for several nights. This experience seems to have drawn Craig very much into the part of the expectant father.
Queer sort of weather we're having. Queer like everything else.
Well, thank God you can always depend on New England for weather. They've got enough for the whole United States.
The sun. And air. Money.
The film now presents its morality directly, again, a Depression-era philosophy about money and how to treat it, that it's better to spend it than to save it. Jane Darwell, who plays Ma Stone, isn't as prominent here as she was in The Grapes of Wrath, for which she won an Oscar a year earlier, but her Ma Stone is the same kind of rock on which her family is built, and she articulates this morality. We've actually got two carryovers from The Grapes of Wrath in this movie, Jane Darwell and John Quaylen, who plays Miser Stevens. Oddly enough, in a role very similar to the one that he played in The Grapes of Wrath. In that film, Quaylen played Muley, the neighbor of the Jodes who has succumbed to the evil around him. He hides out on the land he's been evicted from, taking potshots at the sheriff and the bulldozers. His character lives on the edges of existence. He's a ghostly, wraith-like figure, absorbed like Stevens in a conflict that he can't resolve or escape from.
That's what makes him different from the barnyard critters. Where are you going, son?
This is a neat bit of cinematic magic. When Craig throws that axe and it bursts into flame, what we're really seeing, according to special effects expert Linwood Dunn, who worked on Devil and Daniel Webster, was accomplished by shooting an axe being thrown out of shot on a split screen, then matting in a shot of an axe suspended in midair, and then using an optical printer to put the effect of the axe in flames. It's extremely effective, even 50 years later. Also, listen now here to Herrmann's music. It's scored in time to Huston's speech, matching its beat to heighten the sudden dark and demanding turn of his demeanor. And as a wonderfully loony touch, he's eating a carrot and grabbing a bunch of them before beating a hasty retreat from Moss Stone. He's an extremely folksy devil. He rather makes me think of Mr. Haney from Green Acres in some respects. And it would be difficult to imagine either Claude Rains or Paul Muni, both of whom were interested in the role of Mr. Scratch, pulling it off with quite this much wily aplomb. Curiously, Claude Rains got to play the devil in 1946 in a picture called Angel on My Shoulder, a sort of sequel to Here Comes Mr. Jordan, starring Paul Muni as a criminal consigned to hell who rebels and is offered the chance to serve the devil. Rains's devil was much more urbane and suave. He's the kind of Satan who would invite you to the Russian tea room to discuss your soul, but he would never show up in a barn to discuss business. An odd problem came up during the shooting of this scene. James Craig was called upon to bring forth a sinister laugh, gloating over the survival of his crop, and he couldn't do it. For some reason, he couldn't laugh above a whisper for the camera. So instead, Edward Arnold provided the laugh that issues forth, rather badly post-synced.
You'd think that Stone was standing good with Providence somehow.
My wheat's no more use than last year's crow's nest.
This meeting of the farmers at Cy Bibber's Tavern is telling in a number of ways. For one thing, it reveals that Miser Stevens has entered some fairly dire straits. The setup of this shot and the juxtaposing of Miser Stevens with the other characters is interesting from an ideological viewpoint and a spiritual one. Stevens is desperate to make new loans, but no one is hearing him. He is, as we've discovered, an earlier client of Mr. Scratch's, and his whole existence is now defined by money. Without his loans, he's left with nothing. Opposite him, on the other side of Hank, is Tom Sharp, played by Jeff Corey, always trying to get people to join his grange. Hank is the common man, not as clever as either of those two, and caught between them. Jeff Corey appreciated this element of his role. In a 1991 interview, he commented, "Oh yeah, I played a real troublemaker, going around organizing, trying to get the farmers to go on strike. It was a very political film, as far as I was concerned." He was later one of Hollywood's top character actors and a renowned teacher and director. The irony is that Corey's own alleged real-life political activities resulted in his being blacklisted from 1951 through 1963. Corey came up as an actor in the 1930s, working as a laborer to support himself. He arrived in Hollywood in 1940 and soon after became a founding member of the Actors Lab, a company of socially committed performers that included Morris Karnofsky, J. Edward Bromberg, Roman Bonin, and Lloyd Bridges, among many others. They did important work, but not without a price. In April of 1951, during hearings by the House Un-American Activities Committee, Corey was named as one of those attending a certain communist meeting. He was subpoenaed before the committee, where he refused to answer any questions, citing his rights under the First and Fifth Amendments. He left with his honor intact, but his film career in ruins. Unable to work, he finished college under the GI Bill with the intention of becoming a speech therapist, but instead became an acting teacher and, later, a director. Corey's blacklisting was broken by Pat Boone, who was doing a picture for Fox called The Yellow Canary with Corey as his coach. Boone suggested that he take a part in the film, and Corey explained why he couldn't. Boone decided to take a stand, pushed the matter with the studio, and suddenly Jeff Corey was working again. He worked steadily for the next 39 years in movies like Seconds and Little Big Man and all over television until his death in the year 2002. The Harvest Dance and Birth are justifiably famous for their staging. The actress playing the Stones' servant Dorothy, by the way, was Patricia Doyle, who later married Robert Wise, who was editing The Devil and Daniel Webster.
Hooray for Jabez Stone!
No. That's enough. You want to catch his death of cold?
Don't be cross with him, Ma. This doesn't happen.
The cries of Hooray for Jabez Stone are going to be repeated later in the film in a very different and far more sinister context at another party. The housewarming that Stone has at his new mansion, attended by hundreds of condemned spirits. Stone doesn't know it, but the birth of his son is to mark his last moments of freedom for the next 6 years, because Mr. Scratch has sent that old friend of his along to attend the birth. The plot of The Devil and Daniel Webster is filled with the kinds of parry and thrust between good and evil that we see going on here. It seems Scratch's hold over Stone may be broken, and Scratch ups the ante by sending someone who will seduce him on a level other than money. There are all kinds of entrance scenes in movies, but the one depicting Simone's arrival as Belle is unique for its mixture of patent evil. This is a woman born of flames, and coyness, and that kitten-like purring that was unique to Simone's screen persona. The eeriness of Simone's introduction is enhanced by the deep contrast of this scene. An optical printer makes possible the seemingly blinding glow behind her, and, of course, the incendiary letter of introduction. In the short story, there is no demon woman sent to seduce Jabez. This was an invention entirely for the screen, probably by Dan Tothero, and is a very risque one at that. Under the tenets of the production code then in force, not only weren't filmmakers supposed to show seduction or infidelity, but they were supposed to avoid depictions of supernatural evil in quite so seductive a manner. Such were the crudities of the censor's blue pencil. Of course, horror movies regularly manage to overcome such restrictions, Dracula's Daughter being one classic example, and The Devil and Daniel Webster being another. We're about to see the best reaction shot in the movie, the look of surprise on Ma Stone's face as she lays eyes on the new maid. In subsequent sections of the film, her seduction of Jabez will become more obvious in nature. Dieterle made this movie very challenging to the tastes of the time. This sequence also has a very thick Germanic feel to it that allows the weight of these characters and the morality that they represent to remain in focus, even with the dazzling camera tricks going on in front of us. I should point out just how weird this movie must have seemed to audiences a half a century ago. We've so far seen the devil ambling through a New England village and working his mischief, and a female demon arriving as calmly as you please and insinuating herself into this family. In 1941, it was unheard of to show evil in so casual a light. It's no wonder that many critics were flabbergasted by The Devil and Daniel Webster. They knew they'd seen a very well-made movie, but couldn't define it, which fatally damaged it at the box office. Audiences didn't know what The Devil and Daniel Webster was about. In fact, its implied sexual content probably made it impossible to describe by word of mouth. Right now, I'd like to introduce Stephen Smith, author of the book A Heart at Fire's Center, The Life and Times of Bernard Herrmann. He'll be discussing Herrmann's Oscar-winning score for The Devil and Daniel Webster.
Hello, my name is Stephen Smith, and for the next few minutes I'll be talking about one key ingredient in the success of The Devil and Daniel Webster, and that's its Oscar-winning musical score by Bernard Herrmann. To score the film, William Dieterle had his pick of staff composers at RKO, but instead he went out of house and he chose a 29-year-old New Yorker who had only one film score to his credit. However, that one score happened to be for Citizen Kane, and by 1941, Bernard Herrmann was already considered one of America's most imaginative, dramatic composers. Up to this time, he was best known as a composer and conductor for CBS Radio. During the mid to late 1930s, he'd written a number of very unusual scores for the Columbia Workshop and for Orson Welles' Mercury Theater on the Air. It was Welles who first brought Herrmann to Hollywood to score Citizen Kane. Bernard Herrmann was particular enough, I think, to work with a number of filmmakers who allowed him to experiment, and The Devil and Daniel Webster was certainly no exception. His score for the film combined simple American folk melodies with experimental electronic effects that would influence composers both in and outside the realm of film. Now, if you're familiar with any of Bernard Herrmann's other scores, say for Hitchcock or for Welles, you'll recognize the very distinctive sound of his work. Herrmann believed that the instrumentation, the color of film music, was as important as the music itself, and unlike many composers in film, he insisted on doing his own orchestrations. His music is often dark and brooding, reflecting in films like Psycho and Taxi Driver a very bleak side of human nature. Well, while that's true to some extent in The Devil and Daniel Webster, you'll also hear a much more playful style. It's a style influenced by the 19th and 20th century American music that Herrmann loved and performed as a conductor at CBS. His greatest influence here, I think, was Charles Ives, an American composer who wrote in the early 20th century. Ives was one of the most imaginative and bizarre musicians that America ever produced. He loved to combine very simple American folk themes with dissonant harmonies and strange, complex rhythms. He loved musical cacophony. One of his best-known devices was having two groups of musicians playing different music at the same time, not unlike the band of New Hampshire musicians you'll see in The Devil and Daniel Webster. Herrmann was one of Ives's most vocal champions and a very loyal friend, and in a way I think his music for this film is a tribute to Charles Ives. Herrmann's connection with this story actually goes back to 1937, when he scored a radio version of it for the Columbia Workshop. A few months later, he scored another Daniel Webster story for the program, a half-hour titled Daniel and the Sea Serpent. In these early radio shows, which were all done live of course, Herrmann was already experimenting with the way music could be enhanced through the manipulation of sound. For example, one of the Daniel Webster stories required the sound of a tiny Revolutionary Army playing Yankee Doodle inside a bottle. And to accomplish this, Herrmann first made a delicate arrangement of the tune for very soft strings, woodwinds, and celeste. He then put the musicians in a separate studio from the actors, and during the broadcast he had their playing piped through an electrical filter to complete the effect. Because this was live radio, Herrmann was part of these shows' production teams from the very start. And years later in film, the best directors he worked with also made him part of the process early on. For Citizen Kane, Orson Welles broke with movie tradition, and he had Herrmann write his score as the film was being shot, and the same was true with The Devil and Daniel Webster. William Dieterle introduced Herrmann to the actors, and he invited him to see the rushes, so it's not surprising that Herrmann considered Dieterle one of the most sophisticated directors he ever worked with. As I mentioned earlier, Herrmann weaves some classic American folk themes into his score, not just for mood, but also for sharp dramatic effect. The main title is a perfect example. After those three crashing chords that open the film, we hear a boisterous version of a tune called The Devil's Dream, and I think his choice here is self-explanatory. As this theme carries through the main title, we hear a second, rather plaintive melody played by the woodwinds. It's a tune called Springfield Mountain, a theme Herrmann will associate with the plight of the farmers, and with Jabez Stone in particular. And notice how even as we hear this theme, the Devil's Dream never really goes away. It continues as an almost mocking accompaniment. So immediately Herrmann has set up the basic conflict of the story, in the kind of ingenious musical correlation he'd do again and again in his career.
For your mother to get used to me, but I'm quite sure she will, in time.
Which way do you like them best?
Herrmann was very eager to take advantage of the fact that this was a fantasy film, that he could do unusual things, just as he'd done in radio. He was most excited, I think, about what he could do musically with the character of Mr. Scratch, and he decided to do something different for Scratch's first appearance in the barn.
I'll get him yet.
Your friends are coming.
Now, when you watch that scene, you may not think it's even scored, but it is. Herrmann and sound recordist James G. Stewart sent a recording crew to San Fernando at 4 in the morning, according to Herrmann anyway, where they recorded the sound of humming telephone wires. Herrmann then had the overtones of the musical note C painted onto the film negative. When the film was run through the projector, a phantom fundamental, that is, a sustained tone, was now heard. Herrmann combined the sound with the humming telephone wires, and the final result is that weird, almost subliminal sound you hear during the scene. Herrmann also wanted something special for Mr. Scratch's performance of Pop Goes the Weasel at the barnyard dance. Herrmann later discussed the scene. "We had to have a fiddle reel nobody else could play," he said, "so I had an idea. I simply imposed a series of tracks on top of each other. We had a violinist who played Pop Goes the Weasel, then he played another version, another one, and another one. Then these were all combined to make one violin playing the most impossible things that no one violinist could play. As a matter of fact, when I had the final combination, I played it to Heifetz, and we told him we'd engaged a brilliant young Hungarian, and he said, 'Quick, quick, let me meet him.' When we explained to him what it was, he was so impressed with the technique that he recorded the Bach double violin concerto, playing both parts himself. Of course, people have said to me, you didn't have to do it that way, you could have gotten 4 violinists. Well, it wouldn't sound like one man playing, it would sound like a quartet of violins. It's only a small point in the film, and yet I feel a composer who doesn't pay as much attention to a small point like that is really being overpaid and ought to be dismissed." Unquote. The pride and the testiness you may perceive in that remark are very characteristic of Herrmann. Although he was essentially a very kind person, he did have a temper, and he could be suspicious of people's motives in a way that sometimes bordered on the paranoid. I mentioned earlier that Herrmann uses the folk theme Springfield Mountain in this score. Well, a year later, in 1942, Herrmann's friend Aaron Copland used the theme in his concert piece, A Lincoln Portrait. And after hearing A Lincoln Portrait, Herrmann is said to have written Copland a scathing letter accusing Copland of plagiarism. Whether or not Benny was kidding, I don't think we'll ever know. I've talked about some of the electronic devices that Herrmann uses in The Devil and Daniel Webster. Now I'd like to talk about some of the more traditionally scored sequences, which I think are just as exciting. One is the scherzo that propels Jabez Stone and Belle on their sleigh ride. The rear screen projection in this scene is certainly no better than average for its time, but the music really carries us away, I think if anything does, into Jabez Stone's obsessed state of mind. The musical cue is a rather demented version of a folk tune called Lady MacLeod's Reel, and I think it's another tribute on Benny's part to Charles Ives. Incidentally, you can hear a much more straightforward version of the theme over the end titles of the film. Herrmann's own favorite part of the score was the Miser's Waltz, the piece we hear as Miser Stevens is danced to death by Belle. Throughout his career, Herrmann loved to write melancholy waltzes. You'll hear them in The Snows of Kilimanjaro, The Bride Wore Black, Obsession. No one could make death sound more seductive than he could. And ironically, in 1975, just a few hours before his own heart failed him, Herrmann was talking about this sequence and how fond he was of it. Herrmann and James G. Stewart worked very closely on the film to make sure that music and sound effects weren't fighting each other, and for one action sequence they decided to drop the sound effects completely. Listen to the scene in which Jabez pursues his wife and Daniel Webster on horse, and what's the one thing that you don't hear? Horses' hooves. Instead, Herrmann's music for percussion and brass conveys all the excitement of the scene. Again, Herrmann understood how a non-realistic approach might be the most emotionally vital one. William Dieterle trusted Herrmann so much that it wasn't until the first recording session that he heard a note of the score. Dieterle loved it, and he later told a reporter, "What a pity that such music will not be really heard and appreciated by the people who see our picture. I know what we can do. We'll run the score separately and give them a real double feature." Unquote. Herrmann came up with a better solution, I think, a year later, when he adapted the score into a 5-movement concert suite called The Devil and Daniel Webster. It was first performed on radio by Herrmann, conducting the CBS Symphony, and it became a favorite of Leopold Stokowski, who conducted it a number of times.
Now, lands to goodness, what's happened to that old hen? Daniel, did you use that slingshot again?
In 1942, the year after the film was released, Herrmann's first two film scores for Citizen Kane and The Devil and Daniel Webster were both nominated for Academy Awards. The competition was certainly impressive that year. He was not only up against himself, but such better-known composers as Alfred Newman, Max Steiner, Miklas Rocha, Franz Waxman, and Victor Young. The winner was Bernard Herrmann for The Devil and Daniel Webster. Amazingly, however, this would be Herrmann's only Oscar. In his lifetime, he received only 5 nominations. Not one of his Hitchcock scores, nor The Day the Earth Stood Still, nor The Ghost of Mrs. Muir were even nominated. And the reason, I think, was partly political. Herrmann was a difficult man, and he made a lot of enemies. But I think it was also due to the fact that only in the last 20 years or so has his film music truly been appreciated. He didn't write the kind of melodic scores that inspired hit songs that people could remember. His job, as he often put it, was to get inside the film. And in closing, I'd like to quote a lecture that Herrmann gave in 1972 at the British Film Institute. He said, "The use of music in films is a completely unstudied territory. In the old days, there used to be atlases of the world with unexplored regions marked in white and labeled unknown. Well, that's still what cinema music is like. Whatever music can do in a film is something mystical. The camera can only do so much, the actors can only do so much, and the director can only do so much. But music can tell you what people are thinking and feeling. Music really is something that comes out of the screen and engulfs the whole audience in a common experience." Unquote. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this experience, and I thank you for listening. I return you now to my colleague, Bruce Eder.
For heaven's sake, leave me alone.
I'm all ready.
That's fine, son. Come on. We'll go fox hunting. Up in the upper...
Hello, Bruce Eder here. I'd like to take the time over this previously lost scene to talk about the original casting of the movie. As I said earlier, Thomas Mitchell was cast in the part of Daniel Webster when the film started shooting during March of 1941. Mitchell was, in retrospect, an ideal choice for Daniel Webster. A playwright as well as a character actor, he was capable of playing any varied number of roles on screen, and viewers probably know him best as Uncle Billy from It's a Wonderful Life, Gerald O'Hara from Gone with the Wind, or Jean Arthur's colleague from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Those roles don't reveal much about what Mitchell's performance would have been like. Everyone present, by the way, says that he was absolutely brilliant in the role of Webster. Anyone who wants to see the dignity and intensity and craftiness with which Mitchell could have played Webster should look at John Ford's Stagecoach, made some 2 years earlier, with Mitchell in his Oscar-winning role as Doc Boone. More precisely, one should look at the final 15 minutes of Stagecoach, in which Boone stands up to the outlaw Luke Plummer, his character demonstrating the dignity and resolve that he has been seeking all through the picture. Watch the steely-eyed way he stares down Tom Tyler, and you can see a little bit of what his Webster must have been like. Anne Shirley, who played Mary Stone, told a funny story about this scene. It had already been shot, with her and Thomas Mitchell playing their roles, when Mitchell's injury forced him out of the picture, and Edward Arnold was brought in as a replacement. Rather than redo every shot in this entire scene, what Dieterle did was do a medium 2-shot of the conversation between Mary and Webster, with Anne Shirley and Edward Arnold. He also filmed close-ups with Arnold as Webster, but then that new material was intercut with close-ups of Anne Shirley from the earlier takes with Thomas Mitchell, such as this shot. So this simple scene, according to Shirley, really consists of footage shot several weeks apart, with the actress playing to 2 different actors, only one of whom do we see. She said it felt very strange to watch this in the finished film. Indeed, several of her close-ups are blown-up 2 shots of her and Mitchell. It was a way to save time and minimize the need for reshooting. I would like to talk about Gene Lockhart while he's on the screen, but unfortunately that isn't possible, so I'll do it here. He hovers around the edges of the film as Squire Slossom, who is particularly susceptible to Belle's influence, and we'll see him in the next sequence discussing the party with Jabez. Gene Lockhart is best remembered today for a handful of screen roles, the judge who must decide Kris Kringle's sanity in The Miracle on 34th Street, Louis, the ship's doctor who kills himself by jumping from the mast in The Seawolf, and the corrupt sheriff in His Girl Friday. In his time, however, Gene Lockhart was not only a major stage, screen, and television actor, but a director, playwright, journalist, and a songwriter. He wrote the lyrics to one of the most popular songs of the 20th century, The World is Waiting for the Sunrise. His daughter, June, best known for her roles on Lassie and Lost in Space, was still getting royalties on it in 1989. Surprisingly, in view of his familiar rotund physique in middle age, the Canadian-born Lockhart was also a top college athlete, set several Canadian swimming records, and played on a championship football team. June Lockhart recalls one funny memory from The Devil and Daniel Webster, related by her father. It seems his dressing room adjoined that of Simone Simone and had very thin walls. He complained one night of having heard Walter Huston making romantic advances toward the young French actress. I do want to talk here about Simone Simone. Her belle is one of the most beguiling elements in The Devil and Daniel Webster, and the role came at a time when Simone's career in Hollywood was considered to be ended. Hers is a fascinating tale. Simone Simone was born in France in 1910 and raised in Marseille and later in Madagascar. Her childhood was spent in various cities around Europe, including Budapest, Berlin, and Turin. Simone went to Paris in 1930 to study sculpture and worked as a fashion designer. She later trained as a singer under a teacher who was the mother of the actress Danielle Darrieux, and it was as a singer that Simone initially succeeded in operetta. She got occasional work as a film extra, but her screen career didn't really take off until she was discovered by the director Marc Allégret. Best remembered today as the director of the Josephine Baker movie Zuzu, Allégret was an extraordinary judge of talent, who not only gave Simone her first important screen roles, but also gave Brigitte Bardot her first major film. He put Simone into his feature La Petite Chocolatière in a small role that established her as a comedienne, and later used her in Mademoiselle Nitouche. In 1934, he put her into a serious screen part, and Simone became a star. It was then that 20th Century Fox chief Darryl Zanuck brought her to America. Simone had a very stormy time during her first visit here. After being replaced in the movie Under Two Flags in 1937, her contract was dropped. At around the same time, Simone's secretary was charged with embezzling several $1,000s, and during the trial, the woman's testimony effectively brought her career in America to a standstill. Specifically, the secretary told about the actress's male friends, and about a pair of gold keys to her mansion that the secretary claimed she had paid for with part of the missing money. Those keys, it turned out, were made for George Gershwin, the late composer, who had been very close to Simone. According to the actress in 1991, beyond anything else in their relationship, she and George Gershwin enjoyed a common interest in music. There are also Gershwin scholars who say that the composer wrote Love Walked In with Simone in mind. In any case, when the news of the gold keys became public, the moral climate dictated an end to Simone's career in Hollywood. She returned to France in 1938 and was immediately cast by Jean Renoir in his film The Human Beast. It was that film, when seen by William Dieterle, that got her a second chance in Hollywood. The director chose her for the part of Belle, and that was her reintroduction to stardom. And it was on the basis of The Devil and Daniel Webster that Val Lewton chose Simone for the films Cat People and Curse of the Cat People, the two movies for which she is best remembered today. Getting back to the movie, I'd suggest that viewers who are interested in Stephen Vincent Benét pay special attention to this previously lost scene. It's a pure distillation of Benét's feeling for the United States and for its people.
Well, it's high and it's wide, and it goes a long ways. There's a wind blowing through it. It has a blue roof over it. It's the hills and the rivers flowing to the south, and the new states growing in the west.
Anybody can see that.
No, that's where you're wrong, Mr. Stone. Some people live and die without ever seeing it. They can't see the country for the money in their pockets. They think their state is the country, or the way they live is the country. And they're willing to split the country because of it. I hope you'll meet them all when you've grown up. You'll meet the fire eaters and the Circassian beauties. They're part of the fair, to be sure. But if we had to depend upon them in a permanent sort of way, this country would have stopped at the Allegheny Mountains.
But it didn't stop. I know it didn't stop. Granny told me it didn't.
No, sirree, it didn't. And it won't, no matter what happens. As long as the people at the fair believe in freedom and union. Well, giddy up, Constitution. We gotta be getting on, Mr. Stone.
It was during the filming of this carriage ride, on April 21st, 1941, that Thomas Mitchell was injured. The horses bolted, and Mitchell had to do all he could to save Lindy Wade, the 9-year-old actor he was working with. He had one hand on the reins and the other lowered Wade to the ground. Then the carriage hit a hydrant, and Mitchell was literally thrown through the air into the side of a parked car. He was left unconscious with a fractured skull, and at first the doctors were afraid that there was permanent brain damage. As it turned out, Mitchell recovered fully, but was laid up for 17 weeks. As a result of the accident, the studio ordered Dieterle to replace Mitchell, which he did the next day with Edward Arnold. It was necessary to reshoot all of Mitchell's scenes up to that point, which included almost everything but the trial, which hadn't been shot yet. Rather oddly, most of The Devil and Daniel Webster was shot sequentially, as it appeared in the script, rather than being broken down into scenes using the same sets. Very unusual for any movie. But this made the reshooting relatively straightforward, and probably saved the picture from going even further over budget. Ironically, if not for that accident, The Devil and Daniel Webster probably would have turned a profit instead of running up the small loss it had on its first release. I'd like to say a few things here about Jane Darwell, who plays Ma Stone. She was one of Hollywood's most beloved character actresses for 30 years, and during the silent film era was often paired opposite Guy Kibbe. Darwell was born Patty Woodward in Palmyra, Missouri, the daughter of the president of the Louisville Southern Railroad. She originally sought a career as an opera singer, but her father prevented it, and his objection to her theatrical aspirations caused her to drop her real name. Instead, a friend lent her name. Darwell usually played grandmothers, housekeepers, or aunts in a string of lackluster roles in films until The Grapes of Wrath in 1939. John Ford had already cast the part of Ma Jode, but Darwell knew that it was perfect for her. She had a photograph taken of herself in her baggiest blouse and cotton skirt, without any trace of makeup, and sent it to Darryl Zanuck. The head of 20th Century Fox overruled Ford. Darwell got the part and won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. From then on, right up through her last film, Mary Poppins, Darwell was always given special treatment by filmmakers. The RKO Special Effects Department is back at work again. They'll get busier after Miser Stevens arrives. Notice how much eerier Bernard Herrmann's music makes this segment. Anne Shirley, whom we've seen playing Mary Stone, said in 1991 that everyone involved in The Devil and Daniel Webster thought they were working on the greatest movie anyone had ever made. For Shirley, this was the most important film of her career. She was born Dawn Evelyn Paris in New York City in 1918, and as a baby appeared under the name Dawn O'Day. In 1934, she was selected by RKO to star in its screen adaptation of Anne of Green Gables. As part of the publicity campaign surrounding the movie, she agreed to change her name to Anne Shirley, the name of the character she played from Lucy Maud Montgomery's book. Her other films weren't terribly significant, although she did inherit the lead in Mother Carey's Chickens when Katharine Hepburn walked out on her contract at RKO. Shirley happily gave up the movie business in 1944 after playing the ingenue in the classic film noir Murder My Sweet. She married author Charles Lederer and in 1991 was living in Southern California. Shirley spent the last 15 years of her life working on behalf of AIDS victims and AIDS research and assisting in the securing of more funding for research into the disease. Her portrayal of Mary is often scoffed at by modern viewers for its passivity. Actually, as we'll see in this encounter between Mary and Belle, she does acquit herself rather well. Also, notice how Jabez's shadow is as prominent in the shot as Stone himself.
I know. And you could show me the door. You would, too, if you weren't still hoping the guests might arrive.
You think you're smart, Mrs. Stone. You think Jabez will be lonely, you can be near him again. Looks like your big chance tonight. But you're wrong. You can't win him back. Not that way.
That's my problem. Welcome, Mr. Stevens.
Good evening, Mrs. Stone.
I'm so glad you came.
Yes. Good evening, Jabez.
This is a good time to talk about John Quaylen. His is a name that few people today remember, yet he added a tremendous amount to many of the films in which he appeared. Some viewers may remember him as Muley, the farmer who refuses to leave his land in The Grapes of Wrath, while others may remember him as Earl Williams, the convicted killer in His Girl Friday. Quaylen's Miser Stevens is one of the best things in The Devil and Daniel Webster, even though he isn't on the screen very much and has no dialogue at all in two of his scenes, Mr. Webster's speech and the card game. A lot of his performance is in his eyes, as you can see.
What's the matter with you? You look so...
Aren't you afraid?
Afraid of what?
Of what happens after we die.
Are you plumb crazy, man? What do you think happens? We're buried, that's all.
But what becomes of our souls?
Well, why are you afraid about something that isn't there?
Don't say that. I know it is. I found out.
All right, so it's buried with you.
But what if one hasn't a soul anymore? What of that?
Well, what about it? Who cares anyhow?
Quaylen, by the way, was Canadian-born. It is odd how, in this quintessentially American movie, so many of the cast members come from Canada: Walter Huston, John Quaylen, and Jean Lockhart. And of course, Simone is French, and the director came from Germany. Now we're moving into a special effects tour de force, courtesy of the RKO Optical Effects Department and Bernard Herrmann's music. The influence of this dance sequence can be traced up as far as the 1962 cult movie Carnival of Souls.
Ready for Jabez Stone?
Thanks. Welcome. Eat, drink.
And dance. Music.
Jabez! Mr. Webster's coming!
Well, where is he?
That's his buggy coming up the hill, isn't it?
Mr. Stevens, let's dance.
No, I can't dance.
Oh, yes, you can dance with me.
No.
Mr. Webster, I'm so glad.
Simone remembers that this scene in which she dances with Miser Stevens was shot on her birthday, April 23rd, 2 days after Mitchell's accident. She was wearing a silver gown and ended up completely exhausted from having to hold John Quaylen up for take after take, since his character is literally danced to his death in her arms, as we'll see. In case no one's noticed, it is easy not to in a movie like this. The Devil and Daniel Webster has turned decidedly strange at this point, after a well-played but fairly routine center section. The Bernard Herrmann music helps no end here. This is a piece designated as the Miser's Waltz, and what is done with it is interesting. The music starts following the pattern of Edward Arnold's speech, as his anger intensifies, and Stevens is being waltzed to his death.
All good men of the earth send in trouble because of you. Or am I wrong about those contracts?
Without me and my money, they wouldn't have anything.
They'd have a good neighbor, and that's worth more than anything else. Much, much more.
Oh, no, not for me it isn't.
I'm sorry you can't see that. I know you good once. I heard you make a little speech once that I'll always remember. And the others do, too. They remember what a fine fellow you were. And now they see how you've changed. And that's why they didn't want to come here tonight. You're as blind as a Burma bat, you and your gold pot. Well, mind you, it's not the money I'm talking about. It's what you make of it.
Oh, I don't know what you're talking about.
Let me tell you something.
I haven't time to listen to all of this.
No, you haven't time for anything or anybody. You haven't time for your mother, your wife, or your child.
Oh, I see. It's you. You.
You brought Daniel Webster here.
No, she didn't.
You're trying to make a fool out of me. You played to sneak behind my back, made up all sorts of lies against me. You can get yourself out of her house right now.
Come along, Mary.
Mommy!
Daniel, you stay here.
No, I won't.
Daniel! Why, you...
James, please.
I don't want to talk to you.
You should have done that years ago.
Fetch me a drink. Close the windows. Build a fire.
Feeling chilly? Why, what's the matter, Mr. Stone? You look worried.
You promised me happiness, love, friendship.
Just a minute. I promised you money and all that money could buy. I don't recall any other obligations.
The movie turns nasty as well as playful from here on. This, by the way, is the point where the opera begins, with the arrival of Mr. Scratch at the party. Walter Huston is going to dominate this section of the film, and this is a good opportunity to say something about him. What we're seeing in his performance in The Devil and Daniel Webster is a product of a life and a career that were among the most extraordinary in the entire history of American theater and cinema. Now Miser Stephen's soul has made its brief escape. This is a scene that appears in the short story and the opera as well as the movie. In many ways, Walter Huston is the forgotten Huston. He was, of course, the most famous member of the Klan during his own lifetime, by virtue of his success on Broadway and on the screen. But he had the misfortune to die just a little too early, at age 66, of an aneurysm on the night he was to have celebrated his birthday. His road to this movie was an extraordinary saga. He was born in Toronto, Canada, on April 6, 1884, the son of Robert Huston and the former Elizabeth McGibbon. The family name in those days was spelled Houghston, of Scotch-Irish descent. Huston's father was a contractor and hoped that his son would get started in a solid business. Huston's sister, Margaret, was supposed to be the performer in the family. She possessed a voice that, even in childhood, was recognized as an extraordinary instrument. Huston's mother tried to get him started in music with 3 years of piano lessons, but somehow he never took to formal educational settings. As a child, he loved skipping school to go on adventures of one kind or another. As early as age 5, Huston and a close friend were putting on shows together for the children in the neighborhood. At 14, he was working in blackface in a minstrel show, telling jokes and singing. It was obvious to all concerned that Huston was in love with the theater, or at least what he knew of it from his experiences in and around Toronto during the 1880s and 1890s. At age 16, he got his first taste of professional theater when he was hired to appear in a road company performing a play called The White Heather. He had no interest in college or even finishing high school, despite his parents' hopes that he might study engineering, and when he told this to his mother, she insisted that he go to work rather than keep acting. Huston became a clerk for an asphalt company and later for a variety of merchants, and enrolled in a local acting school. At 17, he became a member of an impoverished repertory company and made his professional stage debut playing an 80-year-old man. The nature of the role was to prove prophetic. Life in the company was Spartan at best, and the lack of food and basic comforts was matched by the inability of the manager to pay the actors regularly. Finally, the stock company disbanded, owing Huston and everyone else a considerable portion of their earnings. He was undeterred, however, and with $3 between them, Huston and a fellow actor friend headed for New York, hopping freight trains and eventually making their way to Manhattan with only a few cents to their names. Huston began working as a waiter, and he or his friend would sneak the other into whatever single room they were renting on any given night. He got some work, mostly in a road company, and the adventure ended on a fairly positive note despite his going home without a cent. There was no turning Huston back now, and while his parents were aghast at the idea of having an actor in the family, Huston's mother, and to a lesser degree his father, eventually gave him their grudging support for his new career. Now Huston was off in earnest. He went to Detroit as the hero in a play called Convict Stripes. It was a simple melodrama, of the kind that never reached very far or high, and was common outside of New York. It was fairly primitive, and none of it was really demanding of Huston as an actor. It was during his second visit to New York in 1902 that he got a chance to work as a stage extra in a Metropolitan Opera production of Les Cid, of which Enrico Caruso was the star. Huston was inspired by the experience, and it seemed just then that he at last had a chance to establish himself on the stage when he was hired to do a 4-line part in a New York production of Julius Caesar. It was at that point that he took an almost tragic misstep. Huston froze when it was time to do the 4 lines on opening night, and in the process blocked the star of the company from making his entrance. And he literally froze. He couldn't talk or move from the stage, and he was finally picked up bodily and removed from the theater. After that, and for the next year, he spent much of his time regaining his confidence. During this period, he picked up a little money playing a season of professional ice hockey as a center. Huston gradually moved back into the theater, taking a job as an assistant stage manager. It was in that capacity, in 1904, that he first met William H. Thompson, a leading light of the stage at that time. It was Thompson who introduced Huston to serious acting and gave him a whole new approach to his work, more sophisticated and worlds removed from the melodramas that he'd done up until then. Huston later called Thompson one of the most profound influences on his work. Thompson also put him into a touring company of the play Sign of the Cross. That same year, Huston met and married his first wife, an aspiring journalist named Rhea Gore. Theatrical work was uncertain, and the two tried any number of ways to support themselves. Among other things, they developed a profitable homemade face powder. Eventually, they went out to the town of Nevada, Missouri. It was an odd situation there, according to family legend, in that Rhea Gore's father had reputedly won a majority of the town's real estate in a poker game. He brought the two of them out there and put Huston to work in the local Department of Public Works, making him superintendent of public utilities in charge of the gas and water works. Huston found that he liked the work and began studying steam engineering and got his license. It was during this period that the couple's son, John, was born in 1905. Huston later moved to Weatherford, Texas, to run its power and light plant, and it seemed as though the theater had been left far behind him in his search for security for himself and his family. It was sometime during this period that he once again was bitten by the theatrical bug. Huston was attending a convention of engineers, and the entertainer who was supposed to appear was unable to perform. Huston still knew his Shakespeare and found the presence of an audience stimulating. He went on stage reading from Hamlet and got a rousing reception from his fellow engineers. In the end, his wish to return to the stage and his somewhat wandering romantic eye caused the couple to split up in 1909. Huston went back to touring, while Rhea Gore kept custody of their son. Huston returned to New York, where his sister Margaret had already achieved tremendous renown as an opera singer. It was while in New York that Huston discovered a talent within himself that he hadn't previously recognized. He learned that he was a master storyteller and raconteur. Unable to secure any legitimate theatrical work, he entered vaudeville in order to put this ability to profitable use. Soon after, he met a female performer named Bayonne Whipple, and the two became partners, first on stage and, in 1915, in marriage as well. They were well known on the vaudeville circuit early in this century, and Huston found that he also had a talent for writing songs. One of his most successful numbers on the vaudeville circuit was I Haven't Got the Do-Re-Mi. The couple's success continued right up into the early 1920s. By that time, vaudeville was a dying institution, and the Hustons discovered that they really had no future in it anymore. Faced with the loss of their savings in a disastrous attempt to put together an opulent stage act, and unable to find work, Huston turned back to the legitimate theater, which at the time would have nothing to do with him. Huston had never really established his theatrical credits before having gotten sidetracked by marriage, and no serious theatrical company wanted to know about a one-time vaudeville comedian looking for work. It was through the intervention of Huston's sister and her wealthy husband that he got his chance to break back into legitimate theater. With Huston's brother-in-law putting up the money, in return for casting Huston in the leading role, Brock Pemberton's production of the play Mr. Pitt opened on Broadway on January 19, 1924. In most cases, a bit of vanity casting such as this could have been an invitation to disaster. In this instance, however, it was fortuitous. To the surprise of audiences and critics who had never heard of the leading man, Mr. Pitt was an instant success, all on the basis of Huston's performance. Theater magazine wrote that in Mr. Pitt, Huston has made one of the conspicuous hits of this season and given one of its most beautiful performances. Huston finally had a career on Broadway after Mr. Pitt. He followed it with one undistinguished play, and then, in the fall of 1924, he was cast in the role that was to transform his life and establish him as a star. Ephraim Cabot in Eugene O'Neill's Desire Under the Elms. I'll say a little bit more about Huston later, but now the trial is about to begin. Later in this scene, Walter Huston knocks on the floor, and the jury of the damned enters. At the time, this completely threw the reviewers, who didn't know what to make of this scene. Today, we're accustomed to the bending of reality into all sorts of bizarre shapes on screen, in films such as Poltergeist and Dreamscape. But at the time, this sequence seemed so off-putting that many critics just tuned out completely. Partly that may be due to the fact that so much is happening here. Not only is the trial finally set up, but the optical printer is also hard at work, introducing these damned souls with the help of a split screen and some double exposure. And what an array of names they are. Some are well known, others are familiar only to folklorists, and a few apparently are creations entirely new to the movie, apocryphal villains. Captain Kidd, real name William Kidd, is of course very famous, although he has been somewhat unfairly maligned by popular legend. William Kidd was much more a privateer, which is to say an unofficial ally of the Royal Navy against their enemies, than a pirate, and his execution was the result of political manipulation as much as for any crime he actually committed. Indeed, he was finally hanged for the alleged murder of a seaman rather than for piracy. Simon Girty was a frontiersman born in Pennsylvania in 1741, who rose to the rank of lieutenant and Indian interpreter in the Virginia militia. In 1778, he switched sides to the British and became a key interpreter and advisor. Girty's name became associated with numerous Indian massacres in which he played no part, since he never commanded a large force of men, but he did personally lead at least 2 major Indian attacks. Sir Thomas Dale was notorious for his administration of justice in Virginia between the years 1614 and 1616. On finding the population out of control and unwilling to work, he instituted martial law and established a criminal code that was one of the harshest of an already brutal era. Floyd Ireson and Stede Bonnet also come from pirate annals, and Bonnet had a fascinating history, both as a historical and a cinematic figure. Stede Bonnet was a retired army major who turned to piracy in order to escape a sedentary life with a nagging wife. He wasn't much of a seaman or a ship handler, and was eventually deposed as captain by his own men. He sailed with Blackbeard for a time, and was known as the gentleman pirate, incidentally, because of his background, which may explain the fact that he was portrayed by James Mason in the feature film Heroes Island. Rather more notably, Bonnet was responsible for an important piece of pirate lore. He was probably the only pirate who ever actually made a man walk the plank. The custom was virtually never practiced, and Bonnet was the man with whom the notion originated. Walter Butler, the king of the massacre, was the son of John Butler, a loyalist colonel in the colonies who founded Butler's Rangers and was responsible for his own share of bloodshed. Both men were known for tolerating a shocking degree of savagery on the part of their Indian allies. In his most notorious act on November 11, 1778, Walter Butler and the Iroquois chief Joseph Brant led an attack by 800 men, including Indians and members of his father's Rangers, against a small village in New York's Otsego County, in what came to be known as the Cherry Valley Massacre. 14 soldiers were killed along with 30 civilians, many of them women and children, and the rest of the town taken prisoner. Big and Little Harp, also known as the Harp Brothers, were a pair of robbers and murderers who worked along the Kentucky and Tennessee frontiers at the end of the 18th century. They also appear as characters in the Walt Disney movie Davy Crockett and the River Pirates, incidentally. Teach the Cutthroat is, of course, Blackbeard the Pirate. Morton the Vicious Lawyer is Thomas Morton, a London-based lawyer who came to Massachusetts with an official appointment and began undermining the Puritan community. Apart from permitting public dancing and drunkenness, and male settlers to dance with Indian women, Morton also armed the Indian population and trained them in the use of firearms. He was later imprisoned for plotting the overthrow of the Massachusetts Bay Company. As to Asa, the Black Monk, he seems to be an apocryphal creation, just for the movie. In the original story, Benét refers to a Reverend John Smeat as a strangler who went to the gallows, who was also a purely fictional creation. And I imagine we all know about General Benedict Arnold. Oh yes, and Justice Haythorne was by reputation one of the Salem witch trial judges who was unrepentant over the bloodshed that resulted from that proceeding. Getting back to Walter Huston, his great leap to stardom came with the role of Ephraim Cabot in Desire Under the Elms. Now, it should be pointed out that Desire Under the Elms was one of the most controversial and towering plays of its era. Up until that time, O'Neill's plays, which included Anna Christie, The Emperor Jones, and The Hairy Ape, had been steeped in mysticism and characterized by their poetical language. Desire Under the Elms was something very different. The play was steeped in biblical inferences about an aging New England farmer, Ephraim Cabot, who brings his new young wife to his desolate farm. She falls in love with his gentle adult son and has a child by him, which she kills. The two go off to prison passionately in love, while the patriarch is left to live out his life in solitude on his barren land. O'Neill's writing was steeped in Old Testament inferences, and on the printed page it was one of the most powerful and daring plays of its time. O'Neill recognized the change in his work, and also the difficulties that would be entailed in realizing it on the stage. He put an enormous effort into the production, but the whole key to Desire Under the Elms was finding someone who could carry the weight of the Ephraim Cabot role. That fell to Walter Huston, and with less than a year's experience in the legitimate theater, he rose to the occasion magnificently. The New York Times wrote, "Walter Huston was ever trenchant, gaunt, fervid, harsh as he should be in the part. In his ability to develop his gradations to express the natural and convincing emotion, and to convey the harsh, inarticulate life, Mr. Huston showed his talent and proved to be the best choice possible for the role." Desire Under the Elms won the New York Drama Critics Circle Award and ran for well over 200 performances, which in those days was a major success for a non-musical play. Of course, at the time, Desire Under the Elms was almost shut down for its allegedly obscene nature, and a public debate raged for weeks until it became clear that audiences regarded it as something extraordinary. It ended up making a resounding impact on the world of theater, and at the center of it all was Walter Huston. He'd won stardom at the age of 40, and over the next few years created an enviable series of dramatic roles, principally of aging men, driven either by demons of madness or a healthy impatience with life. Among the most notable and best remembered, partly because he later brought them to the screen, were Congo and Dodsworth. In 1928, Huston portrayed Deadlegs Flint, a twisted, crippled, revenge-driven madman in Congo, a drama set in Africa, in which he brings down the most horrifying torments upon the men and women whom he blames for his infirmity. In 1934, in the title role of Dodsworth, the stage version of Sinclair Lewis's book, Huston created what in many ways was the quintessential middle-aged American man, restless, always looking for new horizons, new challenges, and new goals to pursue. From Desire Under the Elms onward, it would be a significant aspect of his career that Huston would specialize in playing characters far older than himself. He probably drew much of his ability to do this from what he learned watching the people around him. Ephraim Cabot, according to Lawrence Grobel in his book The Hustons, bore a startling resemblance to his own grandfather. Then there was Howard, the old prospector in The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. And there was Sam Dodsworth, retired after a successful career as an automobile manufacturer and thinking of starting an airline service from New York to Moscow. Both were, perhaps, modeled on his first wife's father. The man was, by accounts, a speculator and a dreamer, who understood land and people and was always seeking fortunes as fast as they slipped through his fingers. His portrayal of Jerry Cohan, the father of George M. Cohan, in Yankee Doodle Dandy, was similarly drawn from his own experiences. He'd played the vaudeville circuit for over a decade, and the song and dance man was a natural. According to Jeff Corey, Huston was a thorough professional on the set of The Devil and Daniel Webster. In fact, he showed up for the first day's filming knowing every line of dialogue. But he was uncertain about his portrayal of Mr. Scratch until he saw the finished film. Jeff Corey recalls that Huston was convinced he had overacted terribly, especially in the final shot, and asked Dieterle for a chance to redo the scene. As we'll see, it works just perfectly, with just the right level of cheerful malevolence, or playful deviltry, if one can excuse the expression. Edward Arnold's speech, which is his best scene in the movie, is nearly done. It's a curious thing, the way people's memories of events differ. Jeff Corey and most contemporary accounts say that Arnold got this speech down in 1 or 2 takes with no problem. But Robert Wise, who edited the film, maintains that the actor had trouble with the speech and that the final version was assembled after a fair amount of difficulty from numerous takes. It is a brilliantly written speech and could be Arnold's best scene of his career as it reaches this crescendo.
We have planted freedom in this earth like wheat. And we have said to the skies above us, a man shall own his own soul. Now here is this man. He is your brother. You are Americans all. You can't be on his side, the side of the oppressor. Let Jabez Stone keep his soul, a soul which doesn't belong to him alone, but to his family, his son, and his country. Gentlemen of the jury, don't let this country go to the devil. Free Jabez Stone. God bless the United States and the men who made her free.
The actor playing Justice Haythorne is, like Thomas Mitchell and Edward Arnold, best known for his work with Frank Capra. Henry Byron Warner, known as H.B. Warner, who played Mr. Gower in It's a Wonderful Life, and Chang in Lost Horizon. He was British-born and originally studied to be a surgeon, but he soon followed his father onto the stage, studying drama in Paris and Florence before joining his father's theater company. He first appeared in America in 1905 and entered films in the silent era, during which his most important role was as Jesus in the silent version of King of Kings. At the time of its release, The Devil and Daniel Webster confused many critics, quite frankly because of the convergence of all the factors that we've discussed. The unusual story in its period setting, the offhanded use of special effects, the presence of some of the finest acting talents then available, and the uncanny ability of William Dieterle to pull it all together in this form. There had been films dealing with the supernatural before. Death Takes a Holiday and On Borrowed Time come to mind. But none of them were made with so clear a sense of style and skill and artistic dexterity, or with the engaging earthiness of Devil and Daniel Webster. From Benét's pen to Dieterle's direction, a miraculous achievement. The public and the press weren't ready for it, but even in failure, numerous films profited from the ground broken by The Devil and Daniel Webster. The most obvious beneficiary was Val Lewton, who became a producer of a series of low-budget but exquisite horror films made at RKO. Cat People, Curse of the Cat People, The Seventh Victim, and The Body Snatcher. All of these were made with a cinematic dexterity that spun directly out of The Devil and Daniel Webster. It isn't that Orson Welles didn't break equally important ground at the same time, but Welles's work was identified as Welles's work. Not only did few people work like him, but after the debacle that befell him, very few cared to try. Webster, by contrast, proved that you could assimilate some of those same elements, the extended takes and dialogue passages, the mobile camera work and the fluid editing, into other kinds of pictures, and that all of these approaches could be used forcefully or offhandedly without seeming awkward, pretentious, or threatening. It has been a special pleasure to walk through The Devil and Daniel Webster in its restored form. Before I go, I would like to point out a couple of changes that were made, both after the preview and after the first release. The original title of The Devil and Daniel Webster was All That Money Can Buy. In that version, the opening credits had a preamble which read, "All these talented people worked to make this picture all that money can buy." When the title was changed to The Devil and Daniel Webster, that preamble was changed. There was also a short overture to the film ahead of those credits, and this too was dropped after the preview. The other matter concerns the end credit music. It was changed after the preview, from a set of variations on The Devil's Dream to a straightforward version of Miss Macaulay's Reel. And isn't that iris effect delightful, closing down on the devil's pointing finger? It predates the iris effect used at the end of the first section of Magnificent Ambersons by several months. In the original version, incidentally, the movie ended with a direct quote from the Benét story, saying that the devil was never again seen in New Hampshire, although they couldn't speak for Maine.